is the story of Saint Augustine when he was a child. The story of Saint Augustine's childhood is different from almost all other saint stories, because it is told to us in his own words. There are many beautiful lives of the saints written by people who tried to write them as truthfully as possible, but who could not be certain of every fact. That is why Saint Augustine's account is so real and so interesting. He begins his story from the very beginning of his life, when he was a tiny baby. Not that he could remember as far back as that, but he watched other babies, and knew that he must have behaved exactly as they did. It was in the little town of Tagaste, on the northern shore of Africa, that Augustine was born in the year of our Lord 354. That little strip of coast with the sea on one side, and the desert on the other, had seen the martyrdom of Peptua and Cyprian when they laid down their lives for the faith, and Augustine might well be proud of his birthplace. His mother, Monica, was a noble lady, loved and honored by all who knew her, whose heart was bound up in that one precious son of hers. Many were the dreams she dreamed of his future as she rocked him in her arms, but it was not of fame or honors that she thought. The prayer that came from the depth of her heart was that her little son should live to be a faithful soldier and servant of the master whom she served. Like all other babies, Augustine began life by sleeping a good deal, crying a good deal, and then, after a while, breaking out into a smile occasionally. Next came a desire to make his wishes known, and as he could not yet talk, he babbled and waved his arms and kicked vigorously. Then if he did not get his own way, like all other babies, he lifted up his voice and wept. Little by little, he learned to walk and to talk, and after that came school. Next I was put to school to get learning, he writes, in which I, poor wretch, knew not what use there was, and yet if idle, I was beaten. It was all very bewildering to a little boy. Why should he be forced to learn things which he did not understand and had not the least desire to know? Those whippings hurt sorely, but they did not explain matters at all. It was the thought of the whippings that made Augustine say his first real prayer to God. So I began as a boy to pray to thee, though but a small boy, yet with no small earnestness, that I might not be beaten at school. He was a thorough boy, eager for games and all sorts of mischief, hating to be forced to stay indoors and learn dull, wearisome lessons, and becoming idle and listless when he ought to have been attending to his work. So of course, a whipping followed, and with a little sore body he crept away and sobbed out the prayer from his little sore soul. He did not understand how it could all be meant for his good. We never quite understand that, until school days are left far behind. As the boy grew older, although he still hated to be made to learn his lessons, he began to be more interested in them, and even to love the ones that had stories in them. Latin I loved, not indeed reading, writing, and arithmetic, but the story of Virgil. Why then, did I hate the Greek classics? For Homer cunningly wove them like fictions, and is most sweetly vain, yet was he little to my boyish taste. And so, I suppose, would Virgil be to Grecian children. The difficulty of a foreign tongue dashed all the sweetness of Grecian fable. Latin I learned without fear and suffering, amidst the caresses of my nursery and jests of friends, smiling and sportively encouraging me. It does not need much patience and perseverance to learn our native tongue, and Augustine possessed very little patience and scarcely any perseverance at all. Which of us, if we sat down to write out a list of our faults, would feel inclined to mention the little mean sins which no one but ourselves knows anything about? It is so much easier to talk about the big faults that sound rather grand, but no one cares to own up to little mean underhand ways. Yet it is those little mean sins which the great saint acknowledges when he writes down in his Confessions, the story of his childhood. He was not always quite straight and fair in games, he says. Sometimes, in his eagerness to be first, and when no one noticed, he cheated just a very little, but enough to win the game. That was bad enough, but if he found anyone else doing something which he considered not strictly fair, he was furiously angry, and talked fiercely about the meanness of cheating. He was fond of showing off, too, and would pretend to be much worse than he really was, just to win the foolish admiration of his companions. There is no doubt that Augustine was a very human little boy. He tells us that in a garden near his house there was a pear tree covered with pears which were neither sweet nor large. But just because they belonged to someone else he thought it fun to steal them, and he and his companions went out one dark night and robbed the tree of all its fruit. They did not care to eat the pears, and, after tasting one or two, threw the rest away to the pigs. There was no particular pleasure, he allows, in doing this, and he would never have done it alone, but he wanted the other boys to think how bold and bad he was, and that he was afraid of nothing. All this scarcely seems as if it could be the account of the childhood of a saint, and yet there was always something saint-like surrounding him, something of which he took no heed, but which never failed him, his mother's love and her earnest prayers. She used to weep, he says, but he took no notice of her tears, counting them womanish and having no desire to mend his ways. But God counted those tears, every one, and he listened to those prayers. Augustine wandered away, like the prodigal in the parable, into the far country of folly and sin, but his mother's prayers were like a golden thread following him wherever he strayed, leading him at last back to God. In God's good time those prayers were answered, and the wild boy, so full of faults and sins, became one of the purest and noblest of his saints. The end.